Hello, we're here again with Michael Ventura, and today we're going to be talking about John Cassavetes and his dealings with John Cassavetes. He made a documentary about him in the mid 1980s, and what's always interested me about John Cassavetes is how he navigated the world of entertainment, how he navigated Hollywood, being a very individualistic character, and also the milieu that he ran in and people that he had in his movies and that were good friends of his, like Peter Falk and Ben Gazzara and many others. So why don't you tell us how you got involved with Cassavetes, Michael?
Okay, Brendan. I got involved with Cassavetes really psychologically, emotionally, whatever you want to call it, when I was a kid, and I mean a kid. I was 11 years old in the beginning of 1957. And the way movies were done, especially in New York City, every neighborhood had a neighborhood movie theater. There were a lot of movie theaters in New York City then. And the neighborhood movies were cheap. I mean, really cheap. For a kid, it was like 15 cents or 20 cents to get in, kind of thing. And a bag of popcorn cost, you could get a nickel bag of popcorn and a nickel Coke, and you were all set up. On weekends, on Saturdays, there would be all day long kid programs, like 10 cartoons, a monster movie, a war movie, a western, a serial. You were there from like 9 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. It was chaos. It was all kids. It was noisy. It was fun. It was, and the parents were just glad to see you go. And there were 2 matrons with long flashlights, bop you on the head. The parents didn't mind at all. They were keeping order. And then in the weekday, they play weekdays, Sundays and weekdays. The neighborhood theaters would play a double feature, which was usually movies that had been issued like a year ago or so, that were finally making it. The prints were making it to the neighborhood theaters, so the prints were awful, and we didn't know it. And B movies. It was always a double feature. You could walk in anytime, walk out anytime. And if you were a kid, if you played hooky like I did, and you'd use your lunch money, which was like a quarter, to go to the movies, or save 2 lunches and go to the movies. And the people at the booth didn't say, "Oh, you're a kid, you should be at school." They just gave you the ticket, told you not to sit in the smoking section. And so I went to the movies like that when I was quite young. I started going to movies like that about 1953, 54, so I'm 8, 9. And I go with my cousins sometimes, my cousin Tony or my cousin Rocco. And New York City at the time was really divided into ethnic neighborhoods. You lived in a mostly Italian neighborhood like we did, which was adjacent to a mostly Jewish neighborhood, to a mostly Irish neighborhood, to a mostly Puerto Rican neighborhood, to an African American neighborhood. And you were aware, but vaguely, that the people on TV, and TV was very different, of course. There were 3 major networks, and New York had 3 more independent networks. We had 6 channels, and then public television came on, so we had 7 channels, and that was more than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And the independent channels showed mostly old movies. So you got a real exposure on TV to old movies that you didn't get anywhere else. There weren't revival theaters yet in the 50s that I know about anyway. But there was this consciousness of movies that was hard to find anywhere else. Because even some big cities just had 2 or 3 stations still. And so, in any case, it's early in 1957. So, since my birthday is at the end of October, 1957, early, I'm 11 years old. And living in a working class neighborhood, not an especially dangerous neighborhood, just a rough neighborhood, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
especially if you're a kid, 11 years old. It wasn't. You had to fear the other 11 years old, and you have all kinds of conflicts, but it was basically play fighting. I mean, it wasn't really. I don't remember anybody ever really getting hurt. But you were always aware. And then if you were a skinny kid like me, who was non-athletic, who was sickly, you were kind of like a rodent running around the streets, being super alert. And so this could have been a weekend, or I could have played hooky. If it was a weekend, it wasn't a kid's day, because they wouldn't show this movie to a kid for Kids' Day. Kids wouldn't be interested. But it was a movie called Edge of the City. And it was, well, now I have to go to the way I looked at movies at the time. And this went on way into my 20s. This was not something just because I was young. Movies to me were another order of life. It was like I was walking in and watching another order of life. I didn't have a sense of them being written. I didn't have a sense of them being directed. They were just another order of life. They existed. And you went to the movies to see this other form of existence. And that, of course, I didn't put that into words or concepts. That was just the way I perceived. I didn't think of them in any other way. Years later, when I found out they were actually directed and written, I was really shocked. Oh my God, this is what I've been watching this whole time. So I go to see this movie just because it's there, not because I'm going to the movies. It's a double feature with something, I don't remember what. And it's the movie playing, so I go to see this other form of life playing. Also, you didn't go at a specific time. You just went to the movies. And it was a double feature. You could stay as long as you want. You could stay as long as the movie was open. And you didn't know when it was going to start, when it was going to end. There weren't listings like that. You just went, and if you walked in on the middle, you stayed through the movie, and then through the next movie, and then you stayed until the part where you walked in on. And if you liked the movie, you watch it again. And if you didn't like the movie that much, if you had something else to do, you'd say, here's where I walked in. Here's where I came in. That's where that phrase comes from. This is where I came in. Mm-hmm. And so the movie playing was Edge of the City. I would learn later that its director, Martin Ritt, who directed, many years later, The Front, about the McCarthy era with Woody Allen and Zero Mostel. He was soon to be or had been blacklisted in the McCarthy era purge of show business. And his stars, there was this white guy who looked really familiar. He looked like the adults on my block. He looked like one of us, which was very unusual in the movies. You did not see people in leading roles who looked, say, Mediterranean ethnic.
Right.
Really, you didn't see it. And the other leading guy, which was totally shocking, and I didn't remember these names, but the other leading guy was this incredibly intense, beautiful, obviously really intelligent. Of course, I'm not thinking this when I'm 11, but I'm getting these impressions. African American. You never saw that. An African American in the lead movie in 1957? No. And I'd seen this African American before. Now remember, I'm not remembering names at the time. I've seen this guy before in a war movie called The Red Ball Express. And he wasn't the star of it. It was about the supply trucks that had to go into the combat zones and keep the front line supplied during World War II in Europe. And it was a very dramatic movie about that. I mean, these guys, the supply trucks going in under fire. It was a thing about truck drivers, but they were in a war. And Sidney Poitier was one of the drivers. And it was the first time, it was the first African American to imprint my imagination. Probably many, many, many other people can say the same thing. And just very impressive. And he had a distinct, good supporting actor role in Red think directed by Bud Bobicher. It was directed, I'm pretty sure. And there was this guy again. Again, I'm not caring about the name, but there was this guy, Sidney Poitier, and there was John Cassavetes, as I would later learn. And I believed them. They were street guys and they're working on the wharves. Now, not only me, but people I knew, nobody made a big fuss in my class, in my ethnicity, about James Dean, for instance, because he was whiny. We looked at him and he was whiny.
Yeah.
he was going, you know, he'd have these things where he'd curl up and yell something, and you know, it's just not. You know, and with nobody had the big thing about Brando, because he was mumbly, and he was whiny too. Really, I could have been a contender. But this guy that I'm looking at, he looked like people I knew. And it was an intense movie. It was kind of a rip-off on the Waterfront. Jack Warden played the bad guy. Ruby Dee, wonderful, wonderful African-American actress, played, I guess, Sidney Poitier's wife, as she would again in Raisin in the Sun.
Yeah.
In Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. And these guys knocked me out because they were people I recognized from my life. Not Sidney Poitier from my life, but that he was in this situation. And Cassavetes, one of the great things about Cassavetes as an actor is he never asked the audience to like him. He presented the character that he was interpreting without trying to charm the audience into liking him. I mean, if you remember him in Dirty Dozen,
right,
where he played cinema's first punk,
yeah,
and he doesn't care whether you like him or not.
Mm-hmm.
He sneers at the audience. He glowers. He has that crazy smile, and he's just being this character, take him or leave him. And he was always like that. And his films are like that once he started writing and directing his films. And it was in New York, or in East Coast city. I don't know if it's actually New York, could have been Pittsburgh or something, in a big East Coast port town. And I thought it was New York. And these guys just knocked me out. They were real to me. They didn't like instantly become friends. They were suspicious of each other. And then they did become friends, and then the drama happens, and I won't kill it for you if you haven't seen it. And as in the ending of On the Waterfront, the ending is not quite believable at all, but I didn't know that then. I identified with this guy. The only other actor I'd identified with personally happened to be, I found out years and years later, a little Sicilian guy from the Bronx named Sal Mineo.
Yeah. I was about to say that.
You know, yeah, and in Rebel Without a Cause, Sal Mineo doesn't do too good. I mean, he does really good as an actor.
Right.
But the guy I'm identifying with in Rebel Without a Cause never made it out of the planetarium.
Yeah.
I didn't think that at all. But he was in another film at the time that I did see in the same way I saw this one, called Six Bridges to Cross. Tony Curtis played played Salminio when he grew up, and it was mainly Tony Curtis's film. And Tony Curtis, his real name was Bernie Schwartz, or a name like that. Right. He was also a tough guy from the Bronx. But he was way too handsome for me to identify with. It was like, where'd that guy come from? But so that was my introduction to John Cassavetes. So it's years later, and it's 1958, I guess. Less than 58, 68. I believe that's right, but I may be a year off or so, maybe earlier. And I'm a working stiff in New York. By that time, I'm a typesetter. Contributing and supporting my little brothers and sister and contributing to my mother. And I'm a working stiff. I never expected to be any more than a working stiff. I was writing every night. That was my passion, and I never got tired in those days. So the rest of the family went to sleep. We lived in the Bronx, one of them in a 2-bedroom apartment. If the rest of the family went to sleep, by 11, I could write till 2 and get up at 6 and go to work. I was never tired in those days. That was a gift. And I would go to the movies a lot, and I kept lists of every movie I saw and who was in it. No directors. I still didn't know movies were directed. So in 68, I'm 22, 23. And I forget why I was in the neighborhood. There was a movie theater called the Little Carnegie, and it was down the street from Carnegie Hall on 57. And there was a tremendous bookstore that had the first floor in the cellar, old-timey bookstore, all kinds of books there. And I was probably in the neighborhood because I was roaming around that bookstore. It was probably a weekend because I had the day off. And I see at the Little Carnegie a film is playing called Faces. I crossed the street. It was starting soon because by then you went when the film was starting. And I just went in to go to a movie, boom. I did not recognize from the director credit that this was the guy I'd seen in Edge of the City. Because he directed Faces, he wasn't in it. And I see this movie. It didn't look like any movie I'd ever seen. It was shot in pale black and white. It was not edited or written like any movie I'd ever seen. The scenes made you really uncomfortable. The guys in it were like people I worked with in my jobs. They were Italian, clearly, and Jewish, and one of the guys maybe Irish. The way they related to each other was like my uncles, like people I worked with on the job. I'm going, what is this? And it was shot really weird. And there was the wife of one of these guys. She tries to commit suicide because I think she was with another woman, and blah, 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 blah. And it just kind of ended. There was no happy ending. And I'm thinking, and I go out of the theater because it just didn't seem like a movie to me.
Yeah.
I go out of the theater, and I stood on the street, and 57th Street's a pretty wide street going east-west of Manhattan. And I'm looking in the traffic and all this stuff, and I'm standing there going, what the did I just see? And I turned right around and I bought a ticket again to go in and see it again. And when I saw it again, I still didn't understand it, but I was transfixed with it because these were people who were us. And I don't mean us like an ethnicity or something like that. I mean, these were people who you could believe you could meet on the street, you could meet in a restaurant.
They're genuine.
This was not Cary Cary Grant.
Right.
This was not Fred Astaire. Nobody was going to break into song. There wasn't happy ending. It was a beautiful woman, Jenna Rowland, and she was an incredible actress. But there wasn't like anybody was acting, and yet they were, because I would learn much later. Although that film was accused of being improvised, it was actually very carefully scripted. So much so that it got an Academy Award nomination for Best Screenplay. Of course, it didn't win.
Really?
But
Wow.
Yeah. Huh. Those lines are completely scripted. The lines in almost all Cassavetes films are completely scripted. And then, fast forward. Cassavetes. Then I'm seeing him in Dirty Dozen. Now I know who he is. And that guy in Dirty Dozen, is the director of that film. Okay, that didn't figure at all. But okay. and he's in Rosemary's Baby.
Right.
And then I'm in Boston. This is 1972. Or maybe, is it earlier? 70, 72-ish. And it's winter. And I tried to go back to college. It didn't work out. But then I've been a working stiff, and for years. And I'd supported the family. And even though I was only what, in 72, 26, then I turned 27 late in 72. Even though that was the case, what am I trying to say here? College didn't work. I was past college.
Yeah.
It was 1970, wasn't 72. So I am 24, 25. And college didn't work. And what was I going to do with my life? I wanted to get out of New York City, so I went to Boston. I knew some people. And I worked as a secretary, because I could type 100-something words a minute. They thought it very weird. In Manhattan, it was okay for a man to be a typist. In Boston, it was not okay for a man to be a typist. When I went to the employment agency, they tried to get me to work doing manual labor outside. I said, lady, it's 5 degrees outside. I just took a typing test for 125 words a minute. I want an inside job typing. And she was very uncomfortable with this. But she sent me on a few interviews. And this guy, Jay Silton at the Silton Advertising Agency, thought it would be weird to hire a male secretary. So he hired a male secretary, just on the weirdness of it. He and I got along all right. So I'm in Boston, and my plan is to stay in Boston a year or so and pay off a few debts, personal debts, because I never stiffed anybody. And then do what I'd always wanted to do, just head west. Just go around. I didn't have a car. By then I learned to drive, but I didn't have a car. Just go around the country, see what's there, get work-a-day jobs, and write. And that was it. That was my dream. It wasn't in my head. I couldn't make the connection. How could I become a published writer? I never made that connection. It didn't seem possible. But one of the great things about writing is you don't have to ask anybody's permission to do it. And all you need is a notebook and something to write it with. And so you don't need materials. You don't have to ask permission. You can just do it. Nobody can stop you. Nobody may publish you, but nobody can stop you from doing it. And you don't have to ask permission, as I've said 3 times. That was very important to me at the time. And you're on your own. So that was the plan. I was already writing. I can't tell if it was good or bad. Most of that stuff has been lost. That's probably for the good. But, so I'm a working stiff in Boston. I have a couple of roommates, Bruce and Gene, and Gene with a G. And I'm going to the movies. I went to the movies a lot. And I go to see this movie, husbands. By now I know John Cassavetes is a director and a writer. And it's a John Cassavetes movies, and I haven't seen one since Faces. But after Faces, I was going to see everything John Cassavetes put together. And here's a movie about these three guys and their husbands. Now, this is 1970, and what was called then Women's Liberation Movement, the feminist movement, was really getting started in this country, where it was really getting traction. There'd been women's movements in the 19th century. There'd been women's movements that got women to vote early in the 20th, but actual equality was not on the horizon yet, and here was a very vibrant movement that was trying to get there. They wanted to be called Ms. At first they made a big point of not wearing bras. They had a lot to say about how shitty men were. They were shrill, but it was the only way to break through. Most beginning movements are pretty shrill. And they were breaking through. They were making an impression. They were not to be just sloughed off. And here was this movie of husbands. The very guys who seemed to be getting all the crap from what was called at the time the Women's Lib movement. And I went, and there's Ben Gazzara, and Peter Falk, and John Cassavetes. They're three friends. A dear friend of theirs has just died. He's their age. They're in their 40s. And it's clear that they are the sons of immigrants. It's clear if you've been the son of an immigrant. They're the sons of immigrants. There's the Greek Cassavetes. There's the Jew Peter Falk. There's the Italian Ben Gazzara. And they've done what my family and my relatives expected me to do. They'd gotten good jobs, not elevated jobs. Cassavetes he's a dentist. It appears that Gazzara is working in some kind of engineering firm. And Falk is the boss of a crew that works for the water department that is constantly going on emergencies of the pipes breaking down and stuff. And they're good, solid jobs. They can support families. They have nice, little, modest houses, but they have houses. Just the way my uncles and my cousins were getting. It was really the same. And their friend died, and this was about them mourning their friend, and it was about them mourning, am I saying it right? Mourning their dreams. They were not going to become athletes. They were not going to become whatever it was they dreamed of. They were husbands. They had responsibilities. They were normal freaking people. Again, who makes movies about these guys?
Yeah.
Who makes movies about these guys? Who looks at these guys through a lens of sympathy and understanding? With all their warts, with all their faults, with their hopes, with their strengths and weaknesses. Who's going to make a movie about these guys? I saw that movie, and for the next week and a half or so, I brought everybody I knew in Boston to that movie. I brought an old teacher and mentor of mine, Johnny Eartha, to that movie. People I'd known in camps I'd been to, people I'd known in school, and I swear to God, friendships died in the discussions in the cafes after seeing that movie. If you didn't get that movie, if you didn't get those guys, I didn't want to be in the same room with you. And women friends, all kinds of and these wild discussions that went on. Everybody had to work the next day. So that was it. If you got that movie, I'm with you. And if you didn't, I don't want to be in the same room with you. And it was kind of funny, but it was also well, kind of judgmental, but it was also a recognition on my part that this was an important function of art that I wasn't seeing anywhere else in the culture. And here it was. And these still pretty ethnic white guys supporting families. They had kids, they had wives. And at the time, you're talking 1970, there were very few women in the workforce. The economy is depending on guys like these doing their jobs and going to work, coming home, being assholes, being good guys, doing their effing jobs, and being stand-up guys. And if they're not, everything falls apart. And that's very clear subtext of this movie. No matter what you think of these guys, man, they go to work in the morning, their kids are fed, their rent is paid. And everything is depending on that at that period of time. And so time passes, it's 1975, and I'm in Austin, Texas. I went for my dream. I hit the road. This thing happened, and that thing happened, and the other thing happened, and went in Austin, Texas, where I walked into a newspaper and got a job. As it turned out, a film critic. Now, as I've told you before, I didn't really have any background for this, but I was capable. That was clear from my first pieces. I was capable. I knew what I was talking about in terms of information. I didn't get things wrong. I had a background because I'd seen so many pictures. I wasn't a scholar. I didn't know the academics, but I could write a piece, and people would read it and like it or dislike it, agree or disagree, but it held the attention of the reader, and that's all my editor wanted. And so here's this movie, A Woman Under the Influence. It's another John Cassavetes movie. Again, he's not in it. It's Peter Falk, Jenna Rowlands, and a bunch of really fine, well, they're not professional actors, but real faces. And it blew me away. It blew me away. My cousin Rocco, who became an engineer and a yoga master and a super black belt in several martial arts, and a poet with a couple of books, a novelist. Anyway, younger cousin, he came down to see me. And Rocco's smaller than I am, and I'm not tall. But Rocco is immensely strong. I meet him at the airport, and he lifts me off the ground and says, "Did you see that picture? Wasn't that picture the way we grew up? I kept expecting him to lie. I'm thinking, when is he going to lie? And he didn't lie." And I knew exactly what picture he was talking about. He was talking about A Woman Under the Influence. And yes, it was the way we grew up in the sense of atmosphere. It was the way we grew up in the sense that we've seen that kind of breakdown, mental breakdown, emotional breakdown, up close and personal, our mothers, our aunts. But what I said to Rocco was, yeah, except that their kids, that Peter Falk's kids had food to eat, the rent was paid, there was a father there who gave a damn, except for that. And they didn't live in a slum. But there was a picture that, again, this one I knew something about. And it spoke, and with Jen Rowlands giving this incredible performance, it gave me a context for my experience, which is another thing that is a function of great art. it, more so than husbands, it gave me a context for my experience. And in a way, I came through as a film critic after I saw Woman Under the Influence. I wrote a long piece about it for the Austin Sun. And I used that piece, or parts of that piece, later, when I'm in L.A., working as a film critic for L.A. Weekly, and I see that John Cassavetes, there used to be an L.A. film festival called Film X. This is 40 years ago. And it's been replaced by the AFI Film Festival. And Film X was going to feature a retrospective of John Cassavetes' films. Because Cassavetes, he didn't own husbands, but he owned faces. He'd financed faces. He financed, out of scraps, A Woman Under the Influence, and a film called Opening Night, and a film called The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, and his first film called Shadows. And they were very rarely seen anywhere. By the way, I have a story for you for A Woman Under the Influence that I learned much later. It was the Friday before, they were shooting on Monday, it was the Friday before. And his colleagues come to him, producers, that kind of thing, people he'd worked with before, people who knew his style, and say, John, we don't have film. We haven't got any money for film. We got to buy film stock. And John said, we're shooting on Monday. And he said, we're not shooting. We can't shoot without film. And John said, we are shooting the effing cameras on Monday, whether there's film in those cameras or not. And those people, God bless them, went out and got the film somehow, because he wasn't kidding. And when later I got involved with the John Cassavetes circle, there was a phrase you'd hear. I said it, other people had said it. Anything for John. Because that's what he inspired. You wanted this man to make the film. Also, I was going a little ahead, but John never said, the way I make pictures. John always said, the way we make pictures. The way we make pictures, something, something, something. Yeah. When we make a picture, something, something, something.
Yeah, that's something you get from the films, is a definite sense that everyone is really participating in making the film and giving something genuine of themselves into the character. It's not as if they're losing themselves in the character, but the character is as a vital part of that actor in the character.
Yes, precisely. Well put. And it's not just the character; it's the crew.
Right. Yeah.
When I was later, on the set with John, he'd talk to anybody. He'd say, "Field Steel, who had a job in the production, what'd you think of that scene?" He says, "Well, it's Cassavetes, John. I don't know. Now tell me what you think of the scene." "Well, I thought it went on too long." "Well, fuck you." They go on from there, but as Freddie Dono, the assistant director, said very well in my documentary, Eddie Dono. Eddie said he wants you to give him what he wants, but he wants you to give it in your way, and that was true up and down the line with him.
Yeah.
In any case, it was going to be a retrospective at Film X. By this time, as the film editor and as kind of the wild man of the show, I go to the editor, Jay Levin, and say, I'm going to do a retrospective on John. They're going to do a retrospective on John Cassavetes. I want to put him on the cover. And you can interview him? No, I'm not going to interview him. I'm going to write him. I'm going to write about him so people understand it. And so I'm writing this big cover piece, really trying to get at why John Cassavetes is as important as any other director, is a pioneer, and even making the prediction that a lot of his film techniques, his camera techniques, his mise-en-scene, as they say, will be used in the future by directors, as it has been. I can look back on that as one of my few successful predictions. But then John has very typically an argument with FilmX, and he pulls all his films out. He's not going to be retrospective. We've got a cover story going to press, and Jay is thinking of cutting that cover. And it's one of those moments, you know me, it's one of those moments when I said, that cover goes or I quit. I worked my butt off on this. This is the only essay that has really encountered John Cassavetes' films, and there was no other essay that had yet been written about John Cassavetes' work as a whole, and in America. And it goes. So there was a cover story of John Cassavetes when there was no John Cassavetes film to see.
Why did he pull his films out of the festival?
I would never try to get in, or even get any information of why John Cassavetes does anything, especially when he's angry.
Yeah.
He had some disagreement with them. I never found out what it was, and he just said, "The hell with you." That was John. It wasn't that it was my way or the highway. That's not how he was. He wasn't that kind of autocrat. He wasn't an autocrat at all. It was, if he disagreed in principle on one of his films we're talking about, not of an actor. He wasn't he got work because he was a good actor, and he tried to serve the film. So he wasn't a prima donna. But if you're talking about his work, then you have to come up to his standard. You can disagree with it. That's not the point. But if he feels like the principle is wrong, he is going to go with the principle every time, no matter what kind of self-destruct it is. And so I never found out why, but there it was. But someone I learned later came to him and read him my essay. Now, isn't this weird? Isn't this a weird part of the story? Because, how did this? I don't take any credit for it. How did the faith, or whatever guides us, or whatever? I mean, I had the nerve, but that's what I had. I was in the right place at the right time. Here's this street kid and John was a street kid too, from Queens. He was originally born in Greece. He learned English as a second language when his people emigrated to the United States. He didn't learn English until he went to first grade. The same thing with my father and my mother. But in any case, how did I get to meet John Cassavetes? This guy write this thing, and this somebody I never knew who read it to him. And I do know what John Cassavetes said. He said, "This guy is my best friend, and we should never meet. We'll corrupt each other." And then, about a year later, something like that. This is 1980. About a year later, somewhere in there, A Woman Under the Influence. No. First. Okay, The Tempest comes out. A film by a guy whose name I'm not remembering, but it starred John and Jenna. No, before that, Gloria came out. That's what it was. Yeah. John directed Jenna in Gloria. And I got an interview with Jenna Rollins. Nobody gets an interview with Jenna Rollins. She doesn't do these things. Hardly ever. It's like nobody, but hardly ever. And we met with her publicist was there, to a woman who was sort of her guard at a restaurant in Beverly Hills, and I with my tape recorder. And when the interview ran in the LA Weekly, Jenna and John were pleased with it. So they liked my essay and they liked the interview. And then they asked me, and by this time, your mother and I are married. They asked me to moderate a panel for a screening of Woman Under the Influence at U.S.A, is it? Yeah, U.S.A. Big university. And so this is when Jan and I come to the venue. It's a theater on the campus. And we're there early and kind of, a bit dressy for us, me anyway. And I see across the lobby, there's John Cassavetes. There's nobody in the lobby. There's John Cassavetes and some people over there. There's us over here. And I walk toward them. What do I do? Hide? He's one of the only people I've ever been intimidated to meet. And he looks at me coming, and as I get to him, he says, "It's Ventura, right? I can tell by the walk." I don't know what that means. and I moderate this. They show a woman, and then there's an interview, and I moderate it. But John takes control of the whole thing. I'm just up there with the microphones pointing. And so then later there's Tempest, and I finally interview John. And at his house up on Mulholland, just off Mulholland Drive. And it's the house they've had forever. You can see that house in Faces, in Woman, in Opening Night. Maybe, no, not in Opening Night. In Miriam Moskowitz, and Love Streams, of course. And we're talking. I got my tape recorder going, and he says, "This isn't going very well." I said, No. I think it's going really well. I can see the sentences in print as you say them, and I know how I'm going to edit the piece, and it's good. And he looks at me a second, and I realize later, John decided to trust me. He decided to see if I knew what I was talking about. Was he going to like the interview or not? Was he going to think it was a good interview or not? And that's kind of where I passed my test in terms of Cassavetes, because he liked the piece. And he loved the essay, which was now 2-3 years before. And then, if you recall, you and Jen and I moved to Austin, Texas.
Oh, yeah.
Where the first thing that happens is, almost the first thing that happens, is I have some kind of heart trouble and end up in the hospital.
I don't remember that.
And, oh, yeah. It had all the symptoms of a heart attack. It wasn't a heart attack, but I was in the hospital. I'm married 4 months, and I'm in the hospital. Not knowing, they got all my stuff on screens, and Jan is by my side. You're allowed to come after the second day, I think. It was about 3 days in the hospital. Thank God the Writers Guild paid for it. Yeah. And also Irene came down from New Mexico to tell me that I was an alcoholic. She just looked me straight in the eye and said, "Michael, you're an alcoholic." And I was kind of shocked, but given how much I was drinking, I could see she had a point. And I said and promised, and I made good on it, "Okay, I'll stop drinking for a year. I'm not going to promise more than that, but I'll stop drinking for a year." And I was still writing for the Weekly. And there was still money from Rhodey or from other movie gigs. Big and I had written several scripts while I was at the Weekly doing all this other stuff. So there was some money. Not a lot, but some. And one night, the phone rings. And It's about 10 o'clock at night in Austin. And I hear, Mike, this is John. And then he starts talking a mile a minute. Well, I'm thinking, who John? I don't know any Johns to call me up and call me Mike. People didn't call me Mike at that time much. And then I realized John Cassavetes has just called me. I don't even know how he got the Texas number. John Cassavetes was calling me, and he's talking about something, and now he's asking me a question. And he says, I'm going to do this film. And it's got a dog, and it's got this, and it's got that, and I don't understand what he's saying. And then he says, I want you to be on the set. I want you to write a diary of the film. And I went, he says, we'll fix it up. You get paid something. We'll fix it up with the production company. It'll be a tough book, but it'll be a good book. And I just said, yeah, sure. When should I be there? And it was like, be there in a month. And you get $5,000, which to be on a set for 2 months. Now, $5,000 doesn't sound like much now, but in 1983,
yeah,
it was a chunk of money.
Well, yeah.
And
where we were at, it was it was good.
Yeah. You know, $5,000 up front. That was a chunk of money. I'd never seen $5,000 in one place, except with Rhodey, and then I blew it. You know, and I say, well, it's not every day a genius asks you to do something. And John gets really mad and says, there's no such of a thing as a genius. It's a lot of fucking hard work and trying to get it. Yes, sir. Taught me something.
Yeah.
And I put down the phone, and I realized I just made this. We just moved all the way to Austin.
Yeah.
And I just made the commitment to take this job that happens to be in L.A. And I gotta tell my wife this. I never had a wife before. Not used to this. And she was great about it, of course. Truly, she was great about it. It was a big ask.
Yeah.
Look, I gotta go. I'll be away for a few months. We might have to move back to L.A. It was a big ask. And she was a champ. And that's part one.
All right.
Because the whole thing of being on the set and what I thought happened and what really happened, that's all part two.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. We'll talk again next week then.